When we looked at the historical origins of Islam in the early Middle Ages, many of us noticed many similarities between the three world religions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. They were both religions of justice and law. They were all religions that believed in a merciful and loving God. And yet, we come up against the story of the Crusades in the Middle Ages. And we ask ourselves, why did these people come to fight each other? Why did the Christians decide to have what they considered a holy war against another culture that at the time they knew very little about? We learned also about Islam that within the caliphates, especially in the early days, there was a lot of sharing of information and knowledge among Christians, Jews, and Muslims in Baghdad, say, in the House of Wisdom. And many of the ideas flowed back into Europe, and eventually Europe would enjoy many of these ideas. And Europe would also enjoy many of the trade items that were traded along the trade routes to the east that the Islamic caliphates controlled. So given these similarities, and given the mutual benefits of contact between the Christian world and the Muslim world, why then would the Europeans decide right about around the year 1000 that they needed to go to war with these people? So what I'm saying here is we have to look beyond the definition of the Crusades as a war about religion, and we have to go deeper. We have to start uncovering some of the true reasons why war would begin. So we have to look at the historical context. The historical context is the big picture. It is the big trends that are happening in that time that would push a war, that would be behind a war. And using the image of behind the war, it is that we don't see it necessarily. What we see is the Christians deciding to have what they consider a holy war, and they're using religious terminology to explain why they're having this war. So we have to we have to dig deeper, because what's being said on the surface is not necessarily what's really happening. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to talk about the historical context, the bigger picture stuff that is pushing Europeans toward more warfare in this time period. The historical context behind the Crusades is a chain of causes that starts with naturally occurring climate change. Starting about the year 800, there was what we call the medieval warming period. And as you can see, there's a spike at the year 1000. And this coincides with an increase in warfare and the Crusades. With just a slight warming in the temperatures of Northern Europe, there were huge consequences. The growing seasons were longer. Spring arrived earlier and winter came later. Plus, there was the introduction of better farming techniques, a three-field system that rotated crops and returned the fertility to the soil in the lands that were not being used. The heavy-wheeled plow, which was an innovation that came from the East, and also the introduction of better sources of protein, such as legumes, lentils, and things like that. And these were higher in protein, and that meant that infant mortality rate went down, and the children that survived childbirth would have a better chance of surviving into adulthood. Thus, the population doubled between the year 1000 and 1340. And there are huge consequences to the European society. the improved food source also came at a cost. Um, there was more food available because they began to open up new agricultural lands. And what that meant was deforestation and the draining of wetlands. And we know now that these are places where carbon is stored. Carbon that is in the atmosphere is stored. And so they created some environmental problems. In the short term, it was very good, but in the long term, we're even today seeing the costs. With a dramatic increase in population, there is going to be a dramatic change in the economy and the society of medieval Europe. Okay, first of all, if you have double the people, that means you have double the consumers. And it's also going to mean that the old social classes, the way the old social classes kept people in their place, that is going to be disrupted. Remember, in the Middle Ages, you have those who fight, those who pray, and those who work. And this doubling of the population and the doubling of economic activity is going to mean the emergence of a new class of people, the middle class. With more productive agriculture and more agricultural land, that meant there was more of a surplus. That meant there was more left over than what you would need to feed your family. And so this stimulated trade. And this stimulated trade throughout regions beyond the Lord's Manor, and beyond the borders of your linguistic group's territory, into other people's borders, into other people's lands. And so this stimulated trade within the kingdoms of medieval Europe, but also eventually the increase of money flowing through this economic system and more profits meant that there was money to purchase luxury items. And so trade expanded into internationally. What were Europeans buying and selling in these regional markets? First of all, where were these regional markets? Well, they were being set up in the towns, the larger towns, and the cities. Okay, the markets. What did they buy and sell there? They bought and sold the basic human needs. Basic human needs are clothing, food, and shelter. So the markets were markets of agricultural surplus, selling extra grain on a market and making money off of that. Also, clothing, the textile industry, the making of fabric. This is the first real modern capitalist industry to appear in the West. Okay, so you have twice the amount of people because of the doubling of the population. You have twice the number of people that need to be clothed, and so it stimulates that industry. Also, you have obviously shelter. Twice the number of people need twice the number of buildings to shelter them. And so it essentially creates a real estate market in these growing cities and towns. This, of course, means more employment. You need people to haul the goods in these trade networks. You need people to build the buildings in the cities and towns. And you need artisans and craftspeople, skilled workers, to make all those clothes and hats. And you need people to work in the market stalls, in the big marketplaces, selling these goods. You basically need people to work retail. And so therefore, this isn't causing an increase in employment, and these people are being drawn from the groups that are getting freed up from the feudal obligations. Let's say the peasant who escapes feudalism and moves to the city. There is a job waiting for him or her. And the growing middle class there are jobs for both men and women, selling, buying, and making. Urbanization is when a society changes because of its encounter with a city. Okay, so the urbanization of society creates new types of people who have different relationships. And so the new city people, who were these people that lived in these new cities and towns? Well, they were a new class of people, a new commercial class. They're not really one of the three medieval classes. Those who work meant those who work with their hands. But this new commercial class, they were people that essentially worked with money. What they produced was wealth. They produced money. And in history, we call them the middle class. In French, it's the bourgeoisie. In German, it was the burghers. The bourgeoisie were originally the business people that set up their businesses just outside the walls of the medieval castles of the lords. And the lords offered them protection with their castles because they had money. The bourgeoisie had money, and the lords wanted to buy the things that the bourgeoisie were selling. And sometimes they needed cash. So sometimes they had to borrow the money from the people that had the businesses making clothes or making hats. And so the bourgeoisie, they had cash because that's what they did. They made money. The medieval lords, they didn't have cash because the wealth that they got was from the land, making the peasants work. And so they weren't getting cash payments from their peasants. They were getting food. Okay, so what they needed, the bourgeoisie had what the lords wanted, and so they offered their protection. And they also wanted to borrow money from them. And so many of these bourgeoisie eventually bought themselves out of feudal obligations. Many of the burghs became independent from the lords that originally sheltered them and protected them. They could buy their way out of feudalism. And so many of these new towns and cities were what were called in the Middle Ages free communes. That was communities established and usually governed by boards of the bourgeoisie. The city governments were run by these people in the middle class. Okay, now, so they're breaking away from feudalism. Another group that's breaking away from feudalism because of the cities and towns are the peasants. Back on the Lord's Manor, there are double the peasants now because of population growth. And there's simply not enough land for those bigger peasant families, those bigger families of serfs. The Lord can just let some people go because there are too many of them, and he doesn't need that many people. And also, the sons of the serf or the peasants aren't going to inherit any land because there's more kids around. There's more mouths to feed, and so their parents let them go. The lords let them go. And peasants can even escape from feudal obligations by running to these new free towns. And many of the new free towns, the bourgs, where the bourgeoisie live, many of those free towns have charters that say that if a peasant or anyone lives within the walls of these new towns for a year and a day, they will be given freedom. They will be given freedom from their feudal obligations from the lord of the rural manor. And so therefore, the workforce that the bourgeoisie are employing are often people that used to be peasants and now have been freed from feudalism. With increased economic freedom and increased social mobility at this time meant an increase in intellectual freedom. The first universities and colleges are starting to open around the year 1000 with this population growth. And these are independent of the church. This new class of people, the middle class, allowed for what historians believe was, in a sense, the invention of adolescence and the invention of childhood. The Middle Ages were a very, very difficult time to live in. If you were the son of a peasant or the daughter of a peasant, by the time you were 8 years old, you'd put on some peasant clothes and you'd go out and work in the field with your parents. You would start being an adult when you were 8 years old and doing the work of an adult. If you were a noble, you would have started fighting as a kid. You would have started your military training as a knight, starting about the year age 8 as well. Okay, so there was no time. There was no time to be a kid or to be an adolescent. But we have this new middle class now. They have extra wealth, and they are professionals. They need education. So their kids don't have to start work immediately. Their kids need to be educated. So there needs to be a time period in people's lives when they're not working and they're just learning and they're just being kids. And so in these new cities and towns, they were full of teenagers. By the time you were about 13, the local parish priest would have taught you everything he knew. And so you needed a little bit more education. And so you'd go to these new medieval colleges and universities. So the towns were flooded with teenagers who lived alone, usually away from their parents, in rooming houses. It was said that many of the kids brought daggers to class, and often fights would break out. On the weekends, they would be filling the taverns, getting drunk, and causing a ruckus. But this created a new class of people, basically, what we would call teenagers. This new vibrant urban culture was symbolized by the new architectural style called the Gothic. Gothic architecture allowed for churches to have much more light inside them, bigger open spaces, and more delicate architectural elements that could be incorporated because of those flying buttresses that you saw on the outside of the cathedral just now. The famous Gothic arches and the fine interior architectural features that you just saw were coming from the non-Western world. They were elements coming from the world of Islam to the south. The regional trade turned to international trade in the luxury items of the East. And the source of those luxury items in the East was the Islamic world. And so the Gothic architectures, the pride of Europe at the time, were indeed influenced by the non-Western world. And there's a little darker side to this whole story. Notice in this image, this tower on this Gothic cathedral was originally a minaret, the tower of the mosque from which Muslims were called to prayer. Before the year 1238, Seville was part of an Islamic Iberian kingdom. But after the Christians conquered, they turned the mosque into a cathedral, and they retained the elements that became Gothic architecture. Double the people means double the trouble. The population increase was good for pretty much everybody but the feudal lord, because you have more of everything except land. Land is finite. A doubling of the population of the class of those who fight is disastrous for feudalism. Remember, a vassal gives his military service to his lord, and in exchange he receives a fief, a piece of land, an estate, with peasants on it. The knights are not paid by their lords. They're rewarded for their service with these land grants or fiefs. And if there are twice as many knights around, there isn't twice as much land to go around. So there are many knights who are not getting rewarded for fighting for their lord. So why should they obey their oaths of loyalty to that lord if he can't reward them? And so there are, in the chronicles, of the medieval chronicles, there are reports of bands of essentially unemployed knights robbing people on the highways because they have nothing better to do. There's no war to fight. And if there was a war, how are they going to get rewarded for fighting? This huge problem for feudalism is an opportunity for the weak monarchies of the Middle Ages. It's an opportunity for them to centralize their power. Why? Well, with the doubling of the population, you have double the people. That means double the people to pay taxes. And you have a more vibrant economy, a growing, prosperous economy. You have those middle-class people in the cities making money. So the kings can buy themselves armies. And there are unemployed knights. Knights who don't have a war to fight in. Knights who are not getting rewarded by their local lords. Fighting men who are looking for work. For this new army, the king can also draw from the much larger population of peasants. So with his new purchasing power from taxes, he can purchase weapons and he can arm peasants to fight wars, as well as knights. And so therefore the king is starting to take away the monopoly that the old feudal knights had on fighting. Whoever has a monopoly on physical violence in a society has a state. And so the kings are going to build a state in Europe primarily through war. So at the time when the European population starts to double, warfare increases in Europe. The monarchies are trying to centralize their power, and you have loads of unemployed, discouraged knights who want to fight. So it's not a coincidence that war breaks out. In 1066, the Normans, the descendants of the Danish Vikings, and the French population of Normandy in northern France, they invade England, and for the next 300 years, the Normans will rule England. South of there, Spain is going to be having a war in the year 1000. This war is against the Muslim kingdoms to the south. Tucked away in the northern part of the Iberian Peninsula, what's known as Spain and Portugal today, there was a Christian kingdom of Castile. And Castile begins to fight in the year 1000 its neighbors to the south. In the north, they're experiencing land problems. There's limited space up there in northern Spain, and the knights need a war. And so the king of Spain organizes an invasion of the southern part of Spain to gain lands to satisfy these land-hungry knights. And this is the opening of the Crusades, which we will discuss in the next presentation.